What if the stories our ancestors told weren't just entertainment, but survival manuals etched into the fabric of history? Picture this: towering walls of water crashing over entire civilizations, leaving behind not just destruction, but a spark of ingenuity so powerful it shaped the course of human progress. Across continents and millennia, flood myths have whispered a haunting truth: that water, both giver and taker of life, demanded more than fear. It demanded answers. And what's truly astonishing, those answers still echo in the dams, canals, and reservoirs we rely on today. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to the legends of the Maya, these tales share an eerie similarity: cataclysmic floods sent by the gods, survivors clinging to hope, and a collective vow never to be caught unprepared again. But here's the twist: these myths weren't just warnings, they were blueprints. Ancient engineers studied the ruins of past disasters, decoded the lessons hidden in these stories, and built systems so advanced some still stand centuries later. How did a tale told around a campfire inspire a network of aqueducts? Why did cultures separated by oceans design nearly identical flood barriers? The answers lie at the intersection of myth and mortar, where human creativity met the relentless force of nature. This journey isn't just about uncovering forgotten legends. It's about tracing the fingerprints of those who turned catastrophe into innovation. We'll explore 22 flood myths that became engineering marvels, from the floating gardens of the Aztecs to the labyrinthine canals of ancient China. You'll discover how a single story could unite entire cities, how fear transformed into foresight, and why these ancient solutions still matter in an age of rising seas and climate uncertainty. So settle in, because the past isn't just prologue. It's a masterclass in resilience waiting to be rediscovered. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh, etched into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories. It tells of a great flood sent by the gods to wipe out civilization, sparing only a righteous man named Utnapishtim, who built a massive ark to save his family and animals. Sound familiar? The parallels to Noah's Ark are striking, but here's what most people miss. The story doesn't end with the floodwaters receding. Utnapishtim's descendants didn't just rebuild, they re-engineered their world. The Mesopotamians, living between the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates rivers, turned myth into mortar, constructing the first known levees and irrigation networks to tame the very waters that once threatened to erase them. This wasn't just survival, it was societal reinvention. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of ancient Sumerian cities like and Lagash, where rulers inscribed their achievements not in battles fought, but in canals dug and flood barriers raised. One inscription boasts of a king who made the waters rise where they should rise and made them fall where they should fall. These weren't empty boasts. The Mesopotamians developed intricate systems of dikes and reservoirs, some so precise they could distribute water to fields miles away. Their flood myths became engineering textbooks, passed down through generations. But why did so many cultures, from the Greeks to the indigenous peoples of the Andes, tell nearly identical stories? Some researchers point to the Younger Dryas period around 12,000 years ago, when melting glaciers triggered catastrophic flooding worldwide. Others argue it's simpler. Water is life, but unchecked, it's also chaos. Every farming society from China to Peru faced the same existential equation. What's remarkable isn't just that they shared similar myths, but that those stories inspired eerily similar solutions. The ancient Chinese, for example, credited their legendary Emperor Yu with taming the Great Flood not by escaping it, but by spending 13 years dredging rivers and redirecting flows. a tale that mirrors real-life flood control projects along the Yellow River. These stories did more than preserve history, they encoded survival strategies. When the Aztecs built their floating gardens on Lake Texcoco, they were applying lessons from their own flood myths, creating raised agricultural beds that could withstand rising waters. Half a world away, the Khmer Empire designed Anka's sprawling barrays or reservoirs, with channels that still baffle modern engineers with their precision. The common thread: each culture listened to their ancestors' warnings and transformed fear into foresight. So the next time you see a modern flood wall or a storm drain, remember, you're looking at the latest chapter in a story that began with a whisper across campfires and clay tablets. These myths were never just about the past, they were blueprints for futures their tellers would never see. And that's the real power of these ancient narratives. They remind us that the greatest human innovations often rise from the waters of our deepest fears. The Sumerian city of Eridu, often called humanity's first metropolis, holds a clue to this extraordinary marriage of myth and engineering. According to the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest written flood narratives, the gods grew tired of human noise and unleashed a deluge to silence them forever. But what happened next reveals more than divine wrath. The survivors didn't just pray for mercy, they built ziggurats, those iconic step temples that doubled as flood-resistant fortresses. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of discovered something astonishing. Hidden beneath the sacred facades were intricate networks of drainage channels, carefully designed to redirect torrential rains away from the city's heart. These weren't just symbolic gestures. The ziggurats' terraced layers acted like giant staircases for water, slowing its descent and preventing catastrophic erosion. Builders even incorporated porous bricks and bitumen sealants, an ancient waterproofing technique, to protect the inner chambers. Imagine the ingenuity, a structure that served as both a bridge to the gods and a shield against their fury. The same priests who interpreted omens in the stars likely oversaw the maintenance of these hydraulic systems, blending ritual with practicality in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. What makes this story truly groundbreaking is how it echoes across other Mesopotamian sites. In Babylon, the famous Etemenanke ziggurat, possibly the inspiration for the Tower of Babel myth, featured similar flood mitigation designs. Cuneiform tablets describe kings taking credit not just for military conquests, but for making the temples withstand the abyss. This wasn't empty rhetoric. When British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s, he found a 3-meter-thick layer of silt separating two phases of the city, physical proof of a catastrophic flood that matched Sumerian accounts. Yet instead of abandoning the site, the people rebuilt smarter, elevating their sacred structures and reinforcing them against future disasters. The brilliance of this approach lies in its duality. Every ziggurat was a theological statement and an engineering thesis, a way to honor capricious deities while outsmarting the very forces they unleashed. This mindset birthed innovations beyond architecture. Sumerian tablets detail advanced irrigation laws, including penalties for farmers who hoarded water during droughts. Their myths warned of divine punishment, but their solutions were profoundly human: cooperation, foresight, and technical mastery. Now, consider how this ancient wisdom rippled eastward to China, where another flood myth would inspire an even grander experiment in hydraulic engineering. Just as the Sumerians saw divinity in water management, the legendary emperor earned godlike status not through conquest, but by dredging rivers, a story we'll explore next. But the lesson of the ziggurats endures. When survival hinges on innovation, even the gods might take notes. While the ziggurats of Mesopotamia stood as monuments to humanity's defiance of floods, China's legendary emperor, you took a radically different approach. He didn't just withstand the waters, he wrestled them into submission. The story begins with a 9-year deluge so catastrophic, it swallowed entire provinces. Ancient texts describe rivers bursting like raging dragons, fields vanishing beneath muddy tides, and desperate villagers climbing trees to escape. But you, unlike his father who tried and failed to dam the waters, understood something revolutionary. You couldn't fight the flood, you had to guide it. The myth paints a vivid picture, you carving channels with a celestial dragon's tail, his body weathered by decades of labor, his hands calloused from shifting mountains of silt. But beneath the magic lies an astonishing truth. Archaeological evidence along the Yellow River reveals precisely engineered levees and diversion channels dating back over 4,000 years, matching the exact timeline of Yu's reign. Sediment cores tell the story in layers of clay and sand, showing where ancient engineers forcibly redirected the river's fury. This wasn't just folklore, it was a hydrological revolution. What's often overlooked is how Yu's engineering genius reshaped China's destiny. By transforming the Yellow River from a destructive force into a controlled lifeline, he didn't just save crops, he centralized power. The Xia dynasty, China's first recorded monarchy, rose from those stabilized farmlands. Ancient texts credit Yu with inventing the concept of taming rivers to unify territories, a strategy emperors would mimic for millennia. His dredging projects became a political blueprint: control the water and you control the kingdom. Modern engineers still marvel at the sophistication of these early systems. Yu's teams didn't just build barriers, they created a network of spillways that allowed controlled flooding, enriching the soil without drowning it. They designed channels wide enough to handle seasonal surges but narrow enough to maintain flow velocity, preventing silt buildup. These principles echo in today's mega projects like the Three Gorges Dam, proving ancient solutions still hold water. But perhaps the most striking parallel lies in the cultural legacy. Yu's myth didn't just celebrate a hero, it enshrined a philosophy. Chinese flood control became a moral duty, with later dynasties competing to outdo each other in hydraulic innovation. The Grand Canal, started centuries after Yu, was more than a trade route, it was a statement that engineering defined civilization itself. Now, let's follow the currents of history to another river that shaped a superpower, the Nile. Where Yu fought against floods, the Egyptians worshipped them, building an empire on the predictable pulse of their sacred waters. But as we'll see, their approach held secrets just as ingenious. While Emperor Yu fought to redirect China's raging waters, ancient Egypt took the opposite approach. They worshipped the flood as a divine gift. The Nile's annual inundation wasn't a catastrophe to prevent, but a miracle to measure. Priests told a haunting story. The river's rise came from the tears of Isis, weeping for her murdered husband Osiris. But behind this poetic myth lay an astonishingly precise water management system that turned sorrow into sustenance. Every summer, as the Nile swelled, scribes would descend stone staircases into nilometers, well-like structures with marked walls tracking the water's climb. Too little rise meant famine, too much meant destruction. The priests didn't just pray, they calculated, correlating centuries of flood data with crop yields. Temple walls depict pharaohs presenting offerings not just to honor the gods, but to guarantee ideal flooding. This was divinity by decimal point. The genius of this system reveals itself in the famine stela, a granodiorite slab recounting a 7-year drought under Pharaoh Djoser. When crops failed, the king dreamed of Khnum, the ram-headed god who controlled the Nile's sources. The deity supposedly revealed hidden springs, but what really happened was far more practical. Archaeologists found evidence of ancient canal projects extending beyond the floodplain, tapping groundwater reserves. The myth justified innovation, turning desperate measures into divine mandates. Nowhere was this hydraulic mastery more visible than in pyramid construction. The same floods that nourished fields also floated 2-ton limestone blocks from quarries to construction sites. Recent satellite imaging reveals long-lost waterways linking the Nile to the Giza Plateau, a logistical network disguised as religious ritual. Workers didn't just build tombs, they became part of a hydrological machine where every bucket of mortar mixed with celestial symbolism. This interplay of myth and measurement birthed history's first hydrological bureaucracy. The overseer of the canals ranked among Egypt's most powerful officials, commanding armies of surveyors who mapped fields with knotted ropes. Tax assessments hinged on flood predictions written in hieroglyphs and mathematics. When Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, he missed the deeper truth. It was the gift of interpreting the Nile. As we cross the Atlantic, we find a civilization that faced the same watery challenges with equally ingenious solutions. The Aztecs didn't just fear their rain god Tlaloc. They built an empire atop his domain, turning a lake into a floating metropolis. But where Egypt's system relied on predictable floods, Mesoamerica's engineers had to outthink hurricanes. The Aztecs faced a paradox. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, sat on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, surrounded by water that could nourish or drown them. Their myth of Tlaloc's flood wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a survival manual wrapped in divine wrath. According to legend, the rain god unleashed a cataclysm after humans neglected their offerings, submerging the world until only 2 survivors remained. But here's where the story pivots from destruction to ingenuity. Instead of fleeing the waters, the Aztecs learned to dance with them, creating chinampas, floating gardens that turned a vengeful lake into the engine of an empire. These weren't mere rafts of soil. Chinampas were feats of ecological engineering, built by weaving reeds into rectangular frames, then layering them with mud dredged from the lake bed. Willow trees planted along the edges acted as natural anchors, their roots knitting the structure together while filtering water. The result, artificial islands that rose and fell with the floods, their porous design preventing waterlogging. Crops grown here yielded 7 harvests a year, triple the output of conventional fields. Modern scientists studying these systems have found something astonishing. The chinampas' layered sediment acted like a sponge, absorbing excess water during storms and releasing it during droughts. But the real brilliance lay in the symbiosis. Aztec engineers didn't just build gardens, they designed an entire ecosystem. Canals between chinampas teemed with fish whose waste fertilized crops. Waterfowl attracted to the area became another food source. Even the dredging process had a purpose, deepening the lake bed, reduced flood risks while providing construction material. This wasn't just farming, it was fluid dynamics meets folklore, where every element served multiple roles. The myth of Tlaloc's flood had embedded a cultural memory. Water demanded respect, not fear. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they described a city crisscrossed by canals, with aqueducts supplying fresh water and dikes holding back saline tides. Tenochtitlan's survival hinged on viewing floods not as punishments, but as partners in productivity. Today, Mexican farmers still use chinampas, and UNESCO recognizes them as a model for sustainable agriculture in flood-prone regions. Now journey east to India, where another flood myth inspired an engineering marvel of a different kind. Here, a king's devotion didn't just appease the gods, it literally moved rivers. The story of Bhagiratha's penance to bring the Ganges to earth is more than spiritual lore. It's a coded lesson in watershed management that reshaped a subcontinent. In the sacred texts of Hinduism, King Bhagiratha's desperate plea to the gods reads like an epic. But hidden between the lines of his story lies one of history's most astonishing feats of hydrological engineering. Legend says he meditated for centuries, begging the goddess Ganga to descend from heaven and cleanse the ashes of his ancestors. When she finally agreed, her turbulent descent threatened to shatter the earth until Lord Shiva caught her in his matted hair, taming her flow into a life-giving river. What's fascinating isn't just the poetry of this myth, but the precision with which it mirrors real geological events. Scientists studying the Ganges path have uncovered evidence of an ancient river capture event, where seismic shifts likely diverted glacial meltwater from the Himalayas into a new channel, creating the river we know today. The Mahabharata's descriptions of Bhagiratha, leading the Ganges across kingdoms, align eerily with human-made canals dug millennia later. In 1854, British engineers constructing the Ganges Canal followed routes detailed in these very texts, unknowingly retracing mythic blueprints. The sacred and the scientific weren't at odds, they were collaborators. Nowhere is this fusion more visible than at Varanasi's Ghats, where pilgrims perform rituals that double as fluid dynamics experiments. The stepped embankments aren't just spiritual sites, they're engineered to handle monsoon surges while maintaining ideal water levels for ceremonies. Priests timing offerings to tidal patterns mirror ancient hydrologists who synchronized irrigation with seasonal flows. Even the act of submerging ashes follows a hydraulic logic. The Ganges' unique microbial composition, long revered as purifying, actually accelerates organic decomposition. This interplay of devotion and engineering wasn't unique to India. As we turn westward, we find another civilization that etched a hero's name into their floodgates, literally. The Greeks didn't just tell stories about Heracles battling river gods. They built diversion channels in his honor, turning myth into municipal infrastructure. When a Thessalian king redirected the Pineos River to prevent floods, he inscribed Heracles' labors on the sluice gates, a reminder that taming waters required both muscle and mythos. What connects these traditions is their refusal to separate the spiritual from the practical. Whether through Bhagiratha's penance or Heracles' strength, our ancestors understood that surviving nature's fury demanded more than technology. It required a story sturdy enough to hold the weight of collective hope. And sometimes those stories still whisper in the rush of water through ancient stones. Heracles wrestling the Nemean lion or capturing Cerberus might steal the spotlight, but his fifth labor, cleaning the Augean stables, holds a secret modern hydrologists are only beginning to appreciate. The myth seems absurd at first glance, a hero rerouting two entire rivers to wash away decades of accumulated filth. Yet beneath the fantastical surface lies a startling truth. The Greeks weren't just spinning tales. They were documenting revolutionary water management techniques. Archaeologists tracing the course of the Alpheus and Peneus rivers in Illes have uncovered Bronze Age drainage channels that mirror the legend's description. These weren't simple ditches, they were precisely graded conduits with stone reinforcements, designed to harness seasonal floods for large-scale sanitation. The Mycenaeans, it turns out, had mastered the art of fluvial engineering centuries before classical Greece. One tablet from Pylos even mentions diverting the gods' waters to purify sacred spaces, suggesting Heracles' feat was less a solitary act than a cultural metaphor for communal labor against nature's chaos. What's truly ingenious is how the myth encodes hydraulic principles. The stables, 30 years of filth, likely represent sediment buildup from uncontrolled flooding, a very real problem for early Greek farmers. By redirecting the rivers, Heracles didn't just clean, he prevented future disasters. Modern parallels abound. Los Angeles concrete flood channels and the Netherlands delta works both follow this ancient playbook, taming water through calculated redirection rather than brute force. Now shift your gaze northward, where Viking poets carved warnings into stone. Norse legends of Jörmungandr's thrashing weren't mere monster stories. They were glacial flood alerts in disguise. Runestones near Iceland's Vatnajökull glacier describe the serpent's venom drowning valleys, matching geological records of catastrophic Jökulráp's sudden meltwater bursts from volcanic activity beneath ice sheets. One 11th century inscription even pinpoints safe evacuation routes using coded kennings, proving myth could be as precise as any modern weather alert. The connection between these traditions is clearer than we might think. Whether Greek or Norse, these cultures faced a shared challenge: how to turn survival lessons into stories memorable enough to outlast generations. Heracle's rivers and Jörmungandr's floods weren't just entertainment, they were the PowerPoint presentations of antiquity, using vivid imagery to transmit engineering wisdom. And in some cases, those lessons still hold water today. The frozen rivers of Norse mythology didn't just carve through epic poems, they shaped the very landscape Viking engineers called home. When the Eddas prophesied Ragnarok's cataclysm, a world drowned by the serpent Jörmungandr's thrashing, they weren't spinning fiction. They were documenting a real and recurring nightmare: Jökulráps, the sudden, violent floods unleashed when volcanic heat melted glacial ice from below. These weren't gradual rises, they were watery avalanches capable of scouring valleys clean in hours. Yet instead of fleeing, the Vikings listened to their myths like engineers interpreting blueprints, building berms and diversion channels that still scar Iceland's terrain today. Walk the path of the ancient Vatnsdæla saga near Hofsjökull glacier, and you'll find the evidence underfoot. What look like natural ridges are carefully stacked stone barriers, positioned precisely where folklore warned of Fenrir's frothing jaws. Archaeologists have mapped these structures to historical flood paths, revealing how Viking builders used mythic imagery as topographic guides. A verse from the poetic Edda might describe the Wolf's River swallowing the plain, but on the ground, that translated to reinforced embankments angled 15 degrees westward, the exact direction needed to deflect glacial outbursts away from settlements. The brilliance of this system lay in its dual language. Runestones near danger zones bore cryptic inscriptions. Thor's hammer strikes here when the earth shakes. Modern geologists recognize these as coded warnings, areas where seismic activity often triggered Jökulráps. By wrapping urgent survival knowledge in poetic metaphor, the Norse ensured it would be memorized and passed down through generations. Even their mythic cosmology reflected real hydrology. Yggdrasil, the world tree, wasn't just a spiritual axis. Its roots reached 3 springs, mirroring the triple threat of glacial, volcanic, and tidal flooding that shaped Scandinavian life. Now leap across the world to Australia, where Aboriginal cultures faced a different kind of deluge: rising seas at the end of the last ice age. But their solution was just as ingenious. Where the Vikings built physical barriers, the First Nations people crafted mental ones: songlines. These intricate oral maps, passed down through ceremonial songs, didn't just describe the land, they encoded flood-safe routes across what's now the submerged Sahul Shelf. A single verse might note the kangaroo's path when the spirit waters rose, aligning with ridges that stayed dry even as coastal plains vanished beneath the waves. Modern researchers comparing these songlines with sonar maps of Australia's underwater landscape have found startling accuracy. A Darug elder's description of the Eel Dreaming Trail matches a now flooded river canyon that once provided inland migration routes during sea level rise. Unlike static flood myths, songlines were living databases updated with each generation's observations, ensuring survival knowledge evolved with the environment. When European settlers dismissed these narratives as mere stories, they missed the sophisticated geospatial intelligence woven into every melody. What unites these traditions, whether Viking berms or Aboriginal songlines, is their recognition that surviving nature's fury requires more than physical tools. It demands stories sturdy enough to carry wisdom across centuries, flexible enough to adapt, and vivid enough to never be forgotten. And in that, our ancestors may have left their most enduring flood barrier of all the human imagination itself. Australia's Aboriginal cultures didn't just witness the end of the last ice age. They encoded its lessons into stories so precise, they still guide modern scientists. The Dreamtime narrative of the Great Flood isn't merely symbolic, it's a hydrological record etched in oral tradition. When elders speak of ancestral beings like the rainbow serpent flooding the land, they're describing real events, rising seas that swallowed entire coastlines 12,000 years ago. But here's what makes these stories revolutionary. They didn't stop at describing catastrophe. They charted escape routes, songlines, the intricate navigational maps sung across generations, often trace ridges and plateaus that remained dry as waters rose. Modern researchers using GIS technology made a stunning discovery. These lyrical pathways match exactly with the high ground corridors that would have been safe during post-glacial flooding. A single verse might describe the kangaroo's path up the red rocks, aligning with an ancient ridgeline now confirmed by sonar scans of Australia's submerged continental shelf. This wasn't just poetry, it was geospatial data preservation at its most elegant. Take the story of Ngurunderi, a creator figure from the Ngarrindjeri people. His epic pursuit of a giant moray cod isn't just a creation myth, it's a bathymetric chart. The fish's thrashing tail supposedly carved the Murray River's bends, but the narrative also notes specific landmarks like the place where the waters never reached, which modern surveys reveal as a limestone outcrop that stayed above sea level during the Flandrian transgression. The practical genius of songlines lies in their adaptability. Unlike static maps, these living narratives were updated with each generation's observations. A Darug song marking the eel's dreaming trail corresponds to a now drowned river valley that once provided inland migration during coastal flooding. Elders didn't just memorize these routes, they embedded them in ceremony, ensuring the knowledge survived through dance, art, and ritual. When European settlers dismissed these traditions as primitive folklore, they missed the sophisticated environmental science woven into every syllable. Now, venture north to the Pacific Islands, where another culture turned flood myths into functional architecture. Where Aboriginal Australians used song, the people of Tikopia wielded bamboo. Their legends tell of a time when the sea god Whenua Arofa grew angry and swallowed villages whole until chiefs engineered barriers from the island's most resilient plant. Today, archaeologists find these ancient bamboo breakwalls buried under modern villages, their lattice designs identical to those described in oral histories. The connection between these traditions is profound. Whether through song or structure, our ancestors transformed flood myths into living survival systems. They understood something we're only now rediscovering, that the best defense against nature's fury isn't control, but adaptation encoded in culture. And sometimes that wisdom grows as resilient as bamboo or flows as enduring as a songline. High above Hawaii's lush valleys, the goddess Kahanalii didn't just battle a water spirit, she waged war against erosion itself. Ancient chants describe her wrestling the mischievous Maokuna, a shape-shifting dragon whose thrashing tail carved destructive channels through sacred farmland. But Kahanalii's victory wasn't marked by a slain monster. It was measured in bamboo. Her solution, whispered down through generations, became the Orwai, intricate terraces braced with woven bamboo grids that turned torrential rains from foe to ally. Modern engineers studying these systems have uncovered their hidden genius. Unlike rigid concrete barriers, Orwai flex with the land. The bamboo's hollow stems act like natural pipes, channeling excess water while its tensile strength holds soil in place. During a 2018 storm on Maui, a restored Orwai system in Hanakauai Valley withstood rainfall that collapsed near by modern retaining walls. The secret biomimicry, the same interlocking design Kahanaliai's myth described, layers resembling the goddess's braided hair, creates micro-pockets that slow water's descent, allowing absorption rather than destruction. What's often overlooked is how these myths encoded maintenance rituals. Chants dedicated to Kahanaliai weren't just prayers, they were oral repair manuals. Specific verses reminded farmers when to replace bamboo stakes every 3 harvests or how to angle terraces 15 degrees toward the morning sun. This wasn't superstition, it was generational QA testing. Recent soil samples from ancient Lai Kolo taro farms show these practices maintained optimal phosphorus levels for centuries, something modern agriculture struggles to replicate. Now cross the Pacific to the Columbia River Gorge, where the Celilo Falls once thundered. Here, the Yakama Nation's flood myths warned of salmon vanishing if rivers were restrained, a prophecy fulfilled when 20th century dams silenced the falls. But within those stories lay an engineering insight we're only now understanding: how seasonal floods sculpted ideal spawning beds. Traditional weirs, inspired by coyotes' fish traps in legend, mimicked natural flood patterns unlike concrete dams that disrupted entire ecosystems. The lesson woven through these stories is clear: the best flood solutions don't conquer water, they converse with it. Whether through Kahanaliai's bamboo or coyotes' woven nets, our ancestors recognized that resilience lies in flexibility, not force. And sometimes that wisdom grows as stubbornly as bamboo shoots, breaking through even the heaviest concrete of modern forgetfulness. The Cherokee didn't just fear Actina, the great horned serpent of their legends. They studied its movements like mathematicians decoding nature's blueprints. When elders spoke of Actina's coils churning rivers into whirlpools, they weren't merely spinning cautionary tales. Hidden within those stories lay an astonishing observation: the serpent's spiraling patterns matched the fractal geometry of healthy floodplains. Watch a Cherokee basket maker at work, and you'll see the connection. Their intricate double-weave designs mirror the very curves that allow rivers to dissipate energy during floods. Modern hydrologists confirmed the genius of this tradition when they analyzed the Tennessee River basin. The Cherokees' ancestral lands contained natural meanders with branching ratios nearly identical to their basket patterns, precise mathematical relationships that reduce erosion. Today, engineers apply these same principles in spillway designs, from the curved baffles at Norris Dam to the terraced retention ponds in flood-prone cities. The myth of Actina wasn't just a warning, it was a lesson in fluid dynamics disguised as folklore. What's even more remarkable is how the Cherokee encoded maintenance rituals into their stories. Actina's jeweled forehead scales, said to grant power, correlate with the optimal placement of river stones to stabilize banks. Elders taught that disturbing these serpent stones would invite disaster, an ecological truth later proven by sediment flow studies. When European settlers straightened rivers for navigation, they unknowingly disrupted fractal patterns Cherokee culture had preserved for generations. The result, catastrophic floods like the 1927 Mississippi disaster, where engineered channels magnified destruction while untouched Cherokee lands weathered the deluge. Now follow the serpent's trail across the Atlantic to the Nile's ancient rival, the crocodile god Sobek, where Actina's myths preserved fractal wisdom. Sobek's worshippers built entire cities as hydrological machines. Egyptian engineers didn't just avoid the god's wrath, they mapped his domain, aligning streets with flood channels and positioning temples as flood gauges. At Crocodilopolis, priests tracked Sobek's moods by observing Nile levels in sacred pools, a system so precise it predicted floods decades before modern meteorology could. The parallel between these traditions is no accident. Whether through Uktina's coils or Sobek's jaws, our ancestors recognized that surviving floods required reading rivers like sacred texts, every whirlpool a verse, every meander a prayer. And sometimes the most advanced engineering tools weren't made of steel, but of stories passed hand to hand, generation to generation. Sobek wasn't just a fearsome crocodile god, he was ancient Egypt's master city planner. Beneath the golden amulets and temple hymns, his cult harbored an astonishing secret. The sacred currents worshippers traced in ritual were actually mathematical models for floodwater distribution. Archaeologists mapping Crocodilopolis discovered its streets aligned precisely with the Nile's overflow patterns, creating a hydrodynamic grid so efficient, modern engineers still study its design. The genius lies in its dual purpose. Ceremonial processions followed routes that doubled as emergency drainage channels during inundations. When the floodwaters rose, Sobek's city didn't just endure, it thrived, channeling the life-giving silt exactly where farmers needed it most. This wasn't accidental worship. The Fayum oasis, transformed under Ptolemaic rule, reveals how deeply this knowledge ran. Roman-era canals there mirror the exact angles found in much older Sobek temples, proving these weren't just religious symbols, they were preserved engineering schematics. A papyrus from the 2nd century describes priests using nilometer data to adjust canal gates, their decisions attributed to the god's will. Modern fluid dynamics simulations show their adjustments maintained near perfect flow velocities, preventing erosion while maximizing irrigation coverage. The same principles appear in today's agricultural megaprojects, from California's Central Valley to China's south-north water diversion. Now, follow the water's path northwest to Wales, where another deity hid engineering brilliance beneath mythic terror. The Afanc, a monstrous lake-dwelling beaver from Celtic legends, wasn't just a creature to fear, it was nature's blueprint for flood control. When villagers spoke of heroes like Parija subduing the beast with golden chains, they were encoding early pump technology. The chains described in medieval manuscripts match surviving Roman screw pumps found in Welsh coal mines, devices that kept tunnels dry by mimicking the Afanc's paddle-shaped tail. Here's where the stories turn prophetic. The very mines that used these ancient pumps flooded catastrophically in the 19th century when engineers abandoned superstitious designs for steam-powered models. Modern hydrologists now recognize the Afanc's legend as a warning about disrupting natural water tables, a lesson written in myth centuries before groundwater science existed. From Sobek's sacred grids to Wales' chained monster, our ancestors wrapped survival manuals in stories, knowing some truths are too vital to be left as mere instructions. Beneath the churning waters of Cardigan Bay, the lost kingdom of Cantra Gwaelod isn't just a Welsh legend, it's a medieval engineering manifesto wrapped in poetry. The tale goes that drunken gatekeepers neglected their duty, allowing the sea to swallow 16 prosperous villages. But hidden between the lines of this morality play lies a startling truth. The bells of Cantra Gwaelod, said to still toll beneath the waves, weren't just poetic imagery. They were early warning systems. Medieval manuscripts describe actual bronze bells mounted on wooden platforms along the coast, their clappers rigged to swing with rising tides, a 12th century tsunami alert network disguised as folklore. Archaeologists excavating the bay's submerged peat beds have found the physical evidence. Preserved oak posts arranged in precise grids match descriptions of the kingdom's sea defenses from the Black Book of Carmarthen. These weren't simple barriers, they were staggered walls designed to dissipate wave energy, a technique modern engineers call hydraulic stepping. The same principle reappeared centuries later in Wales coal mines, where 18th century pumps used tiered chambers to control flooding, proving myth and machinery were never truly separate. What makes this story extraordinary is how it evolved. The drowned kingdom motif wasn't just preserved in bardic verses, it became a living laboratory. Local fishermen well into the 19th century used variations of the bell system, adapting it with floating buoys that triggered chimes during storm surges. A 19th century mariner's log from Aberystwyth describes how these buoys saved an entire fleet by echoing the ancient legend. When the bells rang without hands, we knew to seek the high harbour. Now shift your gaze from Welsh coasts to Andean peaks, where another flood myth didn't just inspire infrastructure, it defied earthquakes. The Inca legend of Yunu Pachacuti tells of a world-ending deluge that spared only a shepherd and his flock on Mount Aconcagua. But the real miracle wasn't survival, it was reconstruction. Survivors supposedly built agricultural terraces that swayed with tremors yet never collapsed. Modern seismic engineers studying Moray's circular terraces have found their secret: interlocking stones that shift during quakes before settling back into place, a technique now replicated in Japan's earthquake-resistant skyscrapers. The terraces' brilliance lies in their duality. Each layer wasn't just earthquake-proof, it was a water management system. Channels between stones directed floodwaters downward in spirals, preventing erosion while nourishing crops. Spanish chroniclers recorded Inca priests chanting flood myths while adjusting these channels during solstices, synchronizing ritual with hydrology. Today, UNESCO recognizes these structures as masterpieces of biomimetic engineering, their design mimicking how mountain roots stabilize slopes during heavy rains. From Wales' singing buoys to the Andes' dancing terraces, these stories share a profound insight. The line between myth and manual was always fluid. Our ancestors didn't just recount disasters, they encoded the solutions in verse, ensuring wisdom would outlast even the heaviest stones. And sometimes those solutions still ring clear beneath the waves or hum in the walls of buildings that refuse to fall. When the Inca spoke of Viracocha's tears flooding the earth, they weren't just describing destruction, they were preserving a masterclass in hydraulic engineering. High in the Andes, where rainstorms can strip mountainsides bare, their terraces at Machu Picchu stand as a testament to turning myth into mortar. Each stepped level isn't just farmland, it's a carefully calculated water break, slowing torrents into trickles. Modern geologists studying these slopes made a startling discovery. Inca terracing reduces erosion by a staggering 70% compared to untreated gradients. But the real marvel, these stone staircases to the sky didn't just outlast floods. They laughed in the face of earthquakes that crumbled Spanish colonial buildings. The secret lies in the stones themselves. Inca engineers didn't just stack rocks, they sculpted them like puzzle pieces, fitting irregular edges together without mortar. This technique, called ashlar masonry, allowed walls to sway during tremors before settling back into place. Spanish chroniclers wrote of temples surviving quakes that toppled their own cathedrals, attributing it to devil's magic. The truth was far more ingenious. The terrace's drainage system, a network of hidden channels and porous foundations, acted like a shock absorber, dispersing seismic energy while directing floodwaters away from vulnerable slopes. What's often overlooked is how these structures doubled as climate archives. The spacing between terrace walls corresponds to centuries of rainfall patterns, with wider gaps in drought-prone areas to maximize water retention. Agricultural rituals described in myth, like offerings to Viracocha at specific moon phases, aligned with maintenance cycles for clearing sediment from these channels. The stories weren't just spiritual, they were seasonal repair manuals. Now descend from the Andes to the arid plains of Mesopotamia, where another flood myth hid engineering brilliance beneath divine wrath. The Babylonians told of Enlil's deluge wiping out humanity, but their ziggurats concealed flood control systems that rivaled the Incas. Unlike Viracocha's terraces, which worked with gravity, Babylonian engineers battled a fiercer foe, the Euphrates' unpredictable surges. Their solution, step pyramids that doubled as massive water batteries, with internal cisterns storing floodwaters for drought seasons. The parallels between these cultures reveal a universal truth. Great civilizations didn't just survive floods. They reverse-engineered them, transforming catastrophe into the very foundation of their empires. And sometimes those foundations still stand, whispering secrets to those who know how to listen. Long before Noah's Ark sailed through Hebrew scripture, the Babylonian Atrahasis epic told of a world drowned by divine wrath, and a hero who survived not just by building a boat, but by mastering the waters themselves. The myth describes Atrahasis receiving cryptic instructions from the god Enki. Tear down your house to build a raft, but what historians often miss is the second act of this story, the tunnels. When the flood receded, survivors didn't just rebuild, they re-engineered their entire relationship with water, carving Kanats deep beneath the earth to outsmart future disasters. These weren't mere ditches. Persian engineers perfected Kanats into hydrological masterpieces, gently sloping tunnels that tapped groundwater and redirected it during floods, all without a single pump. The math was breathtaking. A 1-degree gradient over miles of hand-dug channels ensured steady flow without erosion. Modern surveys in Iran's dashed Ekavir desert reveal some Kanats still functioning after 3,000 years, their almond-shaped shafts spaced precisely 30 paces apart, a design that balanced oxygen for diggers with structural integrity. The Atrahasis myth's true legacy wasn't the boat. It was the understanding that survival meant working with water's logic, not against it. What's astonishing is how these ancient systems anticipated modern hydrogeology. Kanat diggers called mukanis used clay cylinders to detect water vibrations, a technique seismologists now mirror with fiber optic sensors. When Isfahan's historic bridges collapsed in a 2022 flood, the adjacent Kanat network remained intact, its staggered air shafts acting like pressure valves. Even the myth's symbolism holds engineering wisdom. Enki's advice to seal the boat with bitumen parallels the waterproof linings found in Kanat reservoirs. Now shift eastward to Japan, where another culture faced water's fury with equal ingenuity. The legend of Tsunami no Mikoto tells of a sea god's wrath stilling the tides, until villagers built towering seawalls from dragon stones. Modern engineers examining the Enyoshi Tsunami stones discovered these weren't just markers. Their jagged, interlocking shapes dissipated wave energy like breakwaters. The same principle now protects Tokyo Bay's floodgates, proving some blueprints are timeless. In the shadow of Japan's restless tectonic plates, the mythical catfish Namezu wasn't just a creature of destruction, it was a reluctant teacher. According to Edo period folklore, this colossal fish thrashed beneath the earth, causing earthquakes and tsunamis whenever the god Kashima loosened his grip. But here's where the story takes a brilliant turn. Villagers didn't just fear Namezu's wrath, they studied it. Along the Sanriku coast, you'll find ancient tsunami stones, some standing over 10 feet tall, carved with warnings like, "Do not build below this point." These weren't mere markers, they were data points. By tracking where past waves had struck, survivors turned myth into a predictive science, positioning their homes where Namezu's reach supposedly faltered. The real engineering marvel, though, emerged centuries later in Kameishi. When modern designers set out to build the world's deepest breakwater, they didn't just consult wave charts, they revisited the legend of Ryugu-jo, the dragon palace from Urashima Taro's tale. The breakwater's curved design, inspired by the palace's mythical coral walls, didn't fight the sea's energy, it redirected it. Like the palace gates that supposedly calmed storms, the structure's staggered concrete blocks diffuse wave force through thousands of tiny collisions, reducing a tsunami's power by up to 40%. Scientists later confirmed what folklore had hinted. Complex curves outperform straight barriers by mimicking nature's own turbulence-dispersing patterns. Hidden within these stories lies a pattern even more fascinating than the breakwaters themselves. The same communities that carved tsunami stones also developed Namezu-e woodblock prints depicting the catfish being subdued by everyday tools like buckets and hammers. At first glance, these seem like superstitious charms, but look closer. The tools mirror the actual implements used to build Edo-era floodgates. The prints weren't just art, they were blueprints disguised as devotion, teaching each generation how to tame seismic threats through infrastructure. Now, journey from Japan's wave-battered coasts to the misty lochs of Scotland, where another myth concealed hydraulic genius beneath its surface. Celtic crannogs, those enigmatic artificial islands, weren't just fortresses. Their wooden pilings, arranged in precise concentric circles, acted as natural wave breakers during storms, while hidden channels beneath the dwellings functioned like primitive water filters. The legend of the Selkies, who supposedly built these islands during moonless nights, might be more than poetic fancy. It could be a coded memory of the maritime engineers who mastered hydrology long before the word existed. What connects Namezu's thrashing to the Selkie song is this. Our ancestors didn't just survive disasters by fleeing or praying. They watched, they learned, and then they built using stories as both compass and hammer. And sometimes the most resilient structures aren't made of concrete, but of tales passed hand to hand, each retelling adding another layer of armor against the sea's endless siege. The rolling green hills of Ireland hide more than just fairy tales, they conceal engineering marvels wrapped in myth. When Celtic bards sang of the Shia, the mystical beings who dwelled in earthen mounds, they weren't just spinning whimsy. Those mounds, archaeologists now realize, were flood-resistant crannogs, artificial islands built with timber pilings so precisely arranged, they could tame the fury of a storm surge. Modern wave tank tests reveal their secret. The crannogs' concentric rings of oak posts didn't just anchor the islands, they shattered incoming waves into harmless ripples, reducing their destructive power by nearly half. Take the crannog at Lagor, where excavations uncovered a design straight out of legend. The outer ring of pilings stood at uneven heights, mimicking the fairy forts described in medieval texts. This wasn't random, it created turbulence that dissipated wave energy, much like modern breakwaters. But here's the twist, the Shia myths encoded maintenance rituals. Folklore warned that disturbing the mounds would unleash floods, a superstition that preserved the crannog's structural integrity for centuries. Dendrochronology proves it. The oldest oaks were replaced in cycles matching lunar phases mentioned in the same tales, ensuring the wood never rotted beyond usefulness. The crannog's brilliance extended below the waterline. Hidden channels between the pilings acted like natural filters, trapping silt to create nutrient-rich shallows perfect for fishing, a feature celebrated in myths of the Shia's endless feasts. Modern engineers in the Netherlands have adapted this concept, building permeable seawalls that encourage marine life while protecting coasts. It's a poignant reminder. What ancient cultures called magic was often just material science veiled in story. Now, journey from Ireland's misty lakes to the sun-baked limestone of the Yucatan, where the Maya transformed another kind of water myth into hydraulic genius. Their cenotes, those sacred sinkholes, weren't just portals to the underworld. They were part of a vast filtration system that turned rainwater into crystal-clear drinking water, a feat we're only beginning to decode. The Maya didn't just worship chalk, they reverse-engineered his storms. When torrential rains lashed the Yucatan, their cities didn't flood, they drank. Hidden beneath the jungle floor lay a secret weapon, thousands of cenotes, those limestone sinkholes sacred to the rain god, transformed into a sprawling water filtration grid. Modern hydrologists drilling into these formations made a startling discovery. The Maya hadn't just used these natural wells, they'd enhanced them, stacking porous limestone layers like a celestial sieve that turned chalk's fury into crystal-clear reservoirs. At Chichen Itza, the sacred cenote reveals the system's brilliance. Far from a simple pit, its walls bear tool marks showing precise excavation, angled channels that directed rainwater through mineral-rich limestone, removing impurities before pooling in underground chambers. But the real innovation was scale. LiDAR scans now reveal interconnected cenotes linked by hand-cut tunnels, forming a regional network that balanced water tables across the peninsula. When drought struck, engineers adjusted flow by plugging tunnels with woven reed filters, a technique still used in modern biofiltration systems. The myth of chalk's floods held the key. Rituals described the god striking the earth with his lightning axe, creating cenotes where his blows landed. Archaeologists found these strike points weren't random. They marked strategic locations where limestone porosity maximized filtration. At Dizibulchaltun, priests timed water offerings to coincide with seasonal aquifer recharge, their ceremonies aligning with hydraulic reality. Today, engineers replicating this system in Mexico City's aquifer recharge projects achieve 30% faster water purification by mimicking the Maya's layered limestone design. Now set sail across the Pacific, where Polynesian navigators didn't just read stars, they decoded them as storm warnings. Their star paths weren't merely routes, they were celestial flood forecasts written in the language of the waves. Hina's failed voyage across the Pacific wasn't just a mythic tragedy, it was the birth of oceanic climate science. When Polynesian storytellers sang of the goddess capsizing her canoe near Tahiti, they weren't just recounting divine misadventure. Hidden within the chants was a hydrographic breakthrough, the precise coordinates where equatorial currents clash with southern swells, creating deadly rips. The star path Hina's brother Maui later carved across the heavens wasn't merely poetic, it was a seasonal storm map, its angles aligning with the Pacific's safest sailing windows. Modern satellites tracking typhoon paths have confirmed something astonishing. These ancient routes, like the Kilauea Channel between Tahiti and Hawaii, still experience 23% fewer cyclones than adjacent waters during peak storm seasons. The real genius lies in how this knowledge was preserved. Polynesian navigators didn't rely on written charts, they encoded the data in chants listing sequential star bearings. A single line from the Kumulipo Hawaii's creation chant might note Hina's tears fall when Cain's star leans west, correlating with a 16th century Portuguese sailor's log that warns of September squalls at 9 degrees south latitude. But where European mariners saw danger, Pacific wayfinders saw opportunity. Their double-hulled canoes incorporated wave piloting techniques inspired by Hina's ordeal, angled hulls that could climb swells rather than fight them, a design now studied by modern shipbuilders crafting storm-resistant vessels. Now ascend from the Pacific swells to the Ice Mother of Tibet, where glacial myths predicted climate change. The Bonpo people's tales of Sipai Jayamo's melting crown didn't just describe past floods, they modeled future ones. When monks spoke of her tears swelling the Mekong, they were tracking something tangible, the rhythmic pulsing of ice caves in the Gangragabu Range. modern glaciologists drilling there found layers of ritual offerings precisely aligned with historical surge events, creating a sacred timeline of glacial advances and retreats. The same myths that warned villagers to move uphill now guide scientists studying Asia's vanishing glaciers, proving yet again that ancient stories often hold the sharpest lenses for viewing tomorrow's crises. High in the thin air of the Himalayas, Tibetan monks didn't just pray for water, they sculpted it. The ancient Zhangzhung kingdom's myths spoke of Sipai Gyalmo, the Ice Mother, whose melting crown threatened to drown valleys in glacial outbursts. But these stories held more than warnings. They hid a solution as elegant as it was ingenious. Centuries before climate scientists coined the term water towers of Asia, Buddhist monks were building ice stupas, conical towers of frozen water that acted like glacial speed bumps, slowing the melt that fed catastrophic floods. The genius of these structures lies in their deceptive simplicity. Shaped like traditional Buddhist stupas, their tall, narrow forms cast shadows that reduced sun exposure, while their compact mass melted far slower than spreading glaciers. Modern hydrologists studying these ancient systems in Ladakh made a startling discovery: ice stupas delay water release by up to 6 weeks, stretching scarce meltwater deep into drought seasons. Villages that once faced alternating floods and famine now enjoy steady irrigation, all thanks to a design inspired by 8th century murals depicting frozen prayers. What makes this tradition revolutionary is how it merges prophecy with permaculture. The same myths that warned of sky lakes breaking their banks also described ideal stupa locations, north-facing slopes where winter winds would naturally sculpt snow into perfect cones. Monks didn't just build, they observed, noting how certain rock formations created wind tunnels that amplified freezing. Today, engineers replicate this knowledge using solar-powered pumps to spray water into freezing air, creating artificial glaciers that supply water to thousands. A 2018 project in the Swiss Alps even adapted the design to combat ski resort water shortages, proving ancient wisdom scales across continents. Now follow the meltwater downstream to the Pacific Northwest, where another culture turned myth into hydraulic calculus. The Salish people's fish weirs, those intricate river barriers long dismissed as simple traps, hold secrets modern engineers are only beginning to decode. Unlike static dams, these woven structures flex with currents, their diamond-shaped openings mimicking the very pattern salmon use to navigate upstream. But the real revelation lies beneath the surface, where water flows not just through the weir, but around it in precisely calibrated spirals. Legends spoke of the salmon chief, who taught humans to build these structures by observing how fallen branches created eddies that tired fish would seek for rest. Modern fluid dynamics simulations confirm the folklore's accuracy. The weir's placement creates low-pressure zones that guide fish effortlessly while preventing debris buildup. During a 2021 Columbia River restoration project, engineers replaced a concrete fish ladder with a traditional weir design, resulting in a 300% increase in salmon passage. The myth wasn't just a story, it was a living textbook on sustainable hydraulics, written in river currents and passed down through generations of watchful eyes. What links Tibet's ice stupas to the Salish weirs is more than ingenuity, it's a philosophy. Both cultures saw water not as an enemy to conquer, but as a teacher to heed. And sometimes the most advanced engineering tool isn't a supercomputer, but a story patiently carried across centuries, waiting for the right moment to flow again. The Micmac didn't just tell stories about Glooskap trapping the water monster, they built his legend into the very rocks of the Bay of Fundy. Their V-shaped stone weirs, inspired by the hero's cunning, aren't just fish traps, They're masterclasses in fluid dynamics disguised as folklore. When the tide rushes in, these ancient structures don't fight the current, they dance with it, guiding fish into woven baskets with a precision that baffled modern engineers. Recent MIT simulations revealed something astonishing. The angle of the Weirs walls creates a gentle vortex, herding lobsters and salmon with 90% less stress than industrial hatchery systems. The secret lies in the myth itself. Glooskap didn't overpower the monster. He outthought it, using its own momentum against it. Archaeologists studying these weirs along the Passamaquoddy coast found stones placed with millimeter-level precision, their curves mirroring the natural flow paths of migratory fish. Elders speak of listening stones that hum when tides align perfectly, a poetic truth confirmed by hydrophones detecting resonant frequencies at optimal trapping times. The Weirs design goes beyond mere function, it's ecological poetry. Unlike modern barriers that disrupt ecosystems, these structures foster them. Their gaps allow juvenile fish to escape, while the central chamber acts as a nursery where crustaceans thrive. Fisheries scientists now replicate this feature in sustainable aquaculture projects, proving ancient wisdom often outpaces industrial innovation. What's often overlooked is how the myth encoded maintenance rituals. Stories of Glooskap resetting his traps every 7th moon correspond to tidal cycles when sediment buildup peaks. Modern LiDAR scans of century-old weirs show repairs consistently timed to these phases, preserving the structure's hydrodynamic efficiency for generations. This wasn't superstition, it was generational data science passed down through allegory. Now, cross the Atlantic to where another culture harnessed myth to master water's chaos. Dutch windmills didn't just pump water, they sang with the voices of drowned saints, their sails turning flood into fertile ground. But that's a story where engineering and legend spin as seamlessly as the mills themselves. The Netherlands' misty marshes held more than just ghost stories. They concealed an entire hydraulic philosophy in the whispers of the Wit Weaven. These spectral, white women of Dutch folklore didn't just haunt the wetlands. They allegedly controlled storms with the sweep of their sleeves, their movements dictating where dikes should rise and where windmills should turn. But beneath the eerie tales lay something far more tangible. Precise hydrological data encoded in myth. Medieval engineers building the first polder systems, those reclaimed lowlands protected by intricate networks of dikes and drains, noticed something uncanny. The turning points in Wit-Weaven legends where the ghosts supposedly changed direction, aligned perfectly with sites where the soil was most unstable, requiring reinforced levees. Modern geologists studying these locations have uncovered the truth. The ghostly paths traced in folklore match subterranean peat layers prone to liquefaction during storms, areas where medieval builders unknowingly piled extra clay and bundled reeds to stabilize the ground. The windmills that drained these polders weren't just machines, they were mythic sentinels. Their sails, turning counterclockwise like the Wit-Weaven's swirling robes, created suction that pulled water upward through hidden channels, mimicking the ghost's legendary ability to lift floods away. Even the rhythm of maintenance followed the law. Millers synchronized repairs with seasonal fog patterns described in the tales, when water tables were predictably low. What's truly astonishing is how these myths became predictive tools. Dutch water boards still reference Wit-Weaven stories when assessing new flood risks, recognizing that the haunted zones often indicate ancient waterways trying to reclaim their path. A 2018 project near Rotterdam even revived medieval ghost maps to locate weak spots in modern seawalls, proving folklore can outlast concrete. Now, journey from the Netherlands' engineered lowlands to the Andes' vertiginous heights, where our final myth awaits. One that didn't just respond to floods, but anticipated them through living architecture. The pre-Incan Ichma people's legend of Pachacamac, the Earth Shaker, didn't just warn of disasters, it inspired terraces that rebuilt themselves. The Chimu didn't just fear the moon goddess sea, they reverse-engineered her divine tantrums. When their myths spoke of her tears dissolving entire adobe cities in catastrophic floods, they weren't just spinning celestial horror stories. Hidden in those tales was a material science breakthrough so advanced, modern engineers are still unpacking its secrets. The key, a humble desert cactus. Chimu builders discovered that mixing juice from the San Pedro cactus into their adobe bricks created a natural waterproofing agent, turning vulnerable structures into flood-resistant fortresses. Recent lab tests reveal why. The cactus's mucilage, a sticky sap rich in polysaccharides, forms a molecular mesh that repels water while allowing bricks to breathe, preventing mold and erosion. NASA are now studying this very formula for future Mars habitats, where radiation-resistant, self-sealing adobe could shield colonists from dust storms. What's extraordinary is how the myth guided the innovation. Sea's legend didn't just describe destruction, it prescribed prevention. Oral traditions specified lunar phases for harvesting the cactus during waning moons when sap viscosity peaked, and exact ratios for mixing 1 part juice to 20 parts clay. Archaeologists excavating Chan Chan, the Chimu capital, found bricks stamped with symbols matching these recipes, an ancient quality control system. The goddess's wrath became a workshop manual. The real genius, though, lies in the material's duality. Unlike modern concrete, which traps moisture and cracks, cactus-reinforced adobe actually heals minor erosion. X-rays of centuries-old walls show how the mucilage reknits microscopic fissures during temperature shifts, a self-repair mechanism biomimicry labs are racing to replicate. When Spanish chroniclers marveled at Chan Chan surviving El Niño storms that toppled colonial buildings, they missed the irony. The primitive bricks outlasted their advanced counterparts by embracing, not resisting, water's logic. Now fast forward to a Mars simulation lab in Arizona, where engineers need cactus juice into Martian soil analogs. The goal, adobe domes that seal their own pores during sandstorms, just as Chimu temples weathered sea's floods. It's a poetic full circle. A myth born from fearing celestial waters might one day shelter humans on a waterless planet. Some blueprints, it seems, are written not just in stone, but in the stories we tell about the forces that shape us. These 22 flood myths aren't just relics of the past. They're mirrors reflecting our own modern struggles with water's power. Every ziggurat drain, every bamboo barrier, every woven fish weir tells the same profound truth. Humanity's greatest innovations often emerge from our deepest fears. The ancients didn't have satellites or supercomputers, but they had something equally powerful: stories that carried survival wisdom across generations like precious cargo. Today, as glaciers melt and coastlines vanish, these narratives offer more than historical curiosity. They're a playbook for resilience, written in the language of myth but grounded in the hard-earned logic of survival. Consider the humility in these tales. Unlike modern engineers who often seek to dominate nature, our ancestors worked with its rhythms. The Maya didn't fight Choc's floods, they filtered them. The Aztecs didn't flee Tlaloc's rage, they floated gardens atop it. Even the Vikings, facing glacial outbursts that could erase villages in moments, built barriers that bent rather than broke. These cultures understood a fundamental principle we're only now relearning. Water can't be conquered, only negotiated with, and their myths were the negotiation manuals. What's truly remarkable is how these stories transcended geography. From the icy fjords of Norway to the sweltering Yucatan jungles, cultures who never met arrived at eerily similar solutions. The same spiral patterns that steadied Cherokee riverbeds appear in Welsh tsunami stones. The layered filtration of Maya cenotes mirrors the stepped purification of Babylonian ziggurats. This isn't coincidence, it's convergent evolution of the human mind, proving that when survival hangs in the balance, creativity follows universal laws. Now, the question isn't just which myth resonates, it's which lessons will carry forward. Dutch engineers are reviving medieval ghost maps to reinforce seawalls. Himalayan villages are building ice stupas against glacial melt. In Louisiana, Choctaw basket weaving techniques inspire modern flood barriers that mimic river cane flexibility. The past isn't whispering, it's shouting, and if we listen, these ancient voices might just guide us through the rising tides ahead. So tell us which flood myth's wisdom could shape our future. Drop your thoughts below and let's keep this conversation flowing. After all, the next chapter of human ingenuity might be hidden in a story we've been telling